Hey, good morning. It's Patricia Murphy. It's Thursday. This is Seattle Now. When I bought some groceries the other day, I had to do a double take when I looked at my receipt and saw how much I spent. And it's not just food. Prices for all sorts of things went up much faster than usual in the last year or so. Seattle Times reporter Alison Saldana will break down what's going on in a minute. But first, let's get you caught up. The end of the state's mask mandate is rapidly approaching. Governor Inslee announced yesterday that he'll start by removing the requirement for masks at large outdoor events as of February 18th. But he's keeping the rules in place indoors and at schools for now. Inslee says he wants a little more time to keep an eye on the data, but expects to have an end date for the remaining mask mandates next week. The ongoing concrete workers' strike is stalling projects around the city and could delay plans to reopen the West Seattle Bridge. Mayor Harrell's office said yesterday the strike is impacting work along the waterfront, the Ship Canal, pedestrian safety improvements on 23rd, and a rapid ride line on Madison, to name a few. More than 300 workers are on strike and apparently in a deadlock with 6 local concrete companies. SDOT says it's done what it can to work around the strike, but if the lumpy gray stuff isn't flowing again by February 20th, it could mean the bridge stays shut longer than planned. As of now, repair work is supposed to be finished up by the end of June. And remember back in November when Apple Cup fans got stranded on the light rail tracks? Yeah, that was totally preventable, according to an audit of the event. KUOW Radio reports that an investigation determined that rods that should have been trimmed were left sticking up from the tracks, and they ripped through the electrical conduit. Apparently, there were also multiple communication failures at play. The agency's CEO wasn't informed until 40 minutes after it happened. If everything seems more expensive right now, well, it is. Inflation is the highest it's been in 3 decades, and we are really feeling it around Seattle. Inflation here is the second highest in the nation behind Atlanta. For a lot of people, it's showing up in their rent. Alicia Love runs an after-school program in Bellevue. Her current rent is just too much, so she and her husband are looking for a new place. And a lot of 1 or 2 bedrooms she found were in the range of $2,000.
When I started looking, I was completely blown away by the prices. I mean, completely blown away.
She thought about an apartment she'd lived in not too long ago, in 2017. It was just over $1,000 a month at the time.
I looked back at that same apartment, and it is now $1,600. So in 4 or 5 years, it has gone up almost $600.
Safe to say, Alicia isn't making $600 more a month, so that was a no-go. She thought about moving further out from Bellevue, too.
I mean, I was looking in Tacoma, and it's almost the same. Maple Valley, Black Diamond, Ravensdale. I have a friend who lives in Everett, and I'm looking up in Everett, and it's about the same. And I have a little Chevy Spark. I get great gas mileage, but gas is the highest it's been in years. I mean, it's been over $4 a gallon. And so the idea of moving, to Everett or something and having like a 45-minute to an hour commute every day each way, that's freaking me out too, because how am I supposed to afford the gas? And then at what point is the gas just making up the difference in rent because it's so small anyway?
Prices for gas, rent, and food in Seattle went through the roof last year, all thanks to inflation coming out of the pandemic-induced recession. Seattle Times graphics reporter Alison Saldana dug into why inflation is so bad here in the Seattle area. Hi, Alison. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Hi, Trish. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So how much inflation happened last year? Just put this in context for us.
Over the last year, Seattle saw a 7.6% increase in its consumer price index, which is basically a gauge to understand the average increase in prices of several goods and items that we use in our everyday lives. And, 7.6% is much higher than the national average, which was something like 7%.
In your piece, you talked a lot about the labor shortage being a huge part of this. Let's break that down a little bit. I'm very curious about how it factors in.
Right. So typically in a recession, there is a drop in the demand for goods and services. People don't want to spend as much, possibly because they're not making as much money. That leads to a drop in the demand for labor. That leads to a higher unemployment rate. And as the economy sort of bounces back, the demand for goods and services grows, and therefore the demand for labor will increase, and that's typically met with an adequate supply of labor. So if there are jobs that open up, there are as many people who have been unemployed who would be looking for those jobs and taking those up. And that sort of helps the economy bounce back after a recession or, gradually return to a more normal state. However, in this particular situation, although there is an increased demand for goods and services, people want more things as they return to the office, as they go back out and, start dining out or returning to in-person events, there hasn't been an adequate supply of labor just yet, especially in the Seattle area. Part of that has to do with the fact that this is across the country, of course, that a lot of women have left the workforce. A lot of women-dominated professions were impacted early on, and a lot of women in particular had to stay home to take care of children with increased childcare constraints like online schooling. And, a lot of those constraints are still in place because the pandemic is still going on, and especially young children still aren't vaccinated, and that is a cause of concern for a lot of parents.
Right. Still a lot up in the air right now. You mentioned Seattle's inflation is second only to Atlanta. Why is it hitting us harder than the rest of the country?
There's another important factor here is that we have been witnessing a housing shortage for a while, and it's particularly hitting hard now because as we sort of bound out of the recession, or we're trying to get out of it, companies aren't able to find workers who can afford to live in Seattle at the wages they're currently offering. And so they are going to have to offer more premium wages so that they can afford to stay around the city. And, some of that cost is going to pass on to consumers.
You mentioned inflation is 7.6%, and I am guessing a lot of people in Seattle didn't get 7% raises over the last year. What did you learn about wages versus inflation in your reporting?
So a key aspect of my research was to not only look at the increase in prices, but to also see if there has been a measurable increase in income that would sort of help with that increase in prices, and that has not been the case. In fact, when we look at the data for 2019, which is prior to the pandemic, the gap between the increase in income then and the increase in prices was something like 0.9 percentage points, which is very low in comparison, at least, to what it is currently, which is a 3.8 percentage point difference. Or it's just much higher. So although incomes have risen and, they've sort of bounded back a bit since the recession that was induced by the pandemic, it hasn't matched with the way prices are rising right now. And that is a major cause for concern.
The place this shows up for a lot of people is in the grocery store when their food for the week is suddenly a lot more expensive. And I know I've done a double take in my grocery bill, and I'm sure this is forcing people to make choices about their lives.
It does. And, we need to remember that there is an equity issue over here. Economists usually pay particular attention to non-volatile items when looking at the consumer price index. So that would mean something like used cars or housing. But the price of volatile goods like groceries, as you mentioned, or gasoline, that impacts people specifically who are forced to travel for in-person work. Groceries is impacting everybody, of course, but there are some people who have been navigating the pandemic differently from others because they can't afford to work remotely. And so they've had to, weather the fact that prices of fuel are rising, and they have to take that on. And it is impacting the way they are able to afford other goods and services and the way they are able to afford rent. And that came up when you spoke to Alicia. And that's sort of what we need to think about, is just that with housing as well, which is a large chunk of what we spend our budget on, that has increased significantly in the Seattle area. And that is going to especially impact people from lower income groups. It's going to especially impact communities of color, younger people, because they are more likely to rent. And so even when we talk about inflation and how it's, these rise in prices are reflected every day in how we're sort of going about our day, it has a greater impact on certain groups more than others, and those groups happen to be more vulnerable groups.
How might this play out? Will inflation eventually slow down?
So the economists that I've spoken to, according to their forecasts, inflation is likely to, come down to a more reasonable rate of increase, especially, as prices of gas, which fluctuate day to day, they're likely to fall eventually, go below $4. As that comes down, the price of many goods is likely to fall a bit. But for the Seattle area, it remains a concern because as long as we have the housing shortage, it's going to affect our labor supply. And, that is inevitably going to impact our prices, among other things.
Seattle Times graphics reporter Alison Saldana, really appreciate your time. Thanks for your reporting.
Thank you, Trish. It was great to be here.
Thanks for listening to Seattle Now. Clare McGrane produced today's show. Matt Jorgensen does our theme music. I'm Patricia Murphy. Have a good one.